I'm Brett Godfrey, and this is Viewpoint. Today we're going to talk about how to focus your inner power, how to tap into that inner capability that you always known you have, but somehow had trouble getting to the surface so that you could achieve more of what you want to do, have more control over your immediate environment, what I like to call your universe, the things that matter to you. But before we do that, I'd like to give you an update. I've been receiving emails and requests for status reports on the sequel to my first novel, Black Sunrise. And those of you who follow me as an author know that the sequel is called Convergence of Demons. And about 4 months ago, I got to the point where I had about 60 pages left to write. I've got a complete outline. I know how the book ends, but I just need to get away from it all so that I can finish the book. So I'm going on a cruise, feel pretty lucky about this, in mid-December, and I'm not coming off of the boat until I have the book done and ready to go to the editors. So it shouldn't be too much longer. Thanks for your patience. I hope you enjoy it a lot. I'll continue to give you updates about it as the podcast continues in coming weeks. So, to today's topic, your power. When I talk about your power, what does that mean? We all sit around and think about, boy, you know, how much power does Elon Musk have? How much power does Joe Biden have? How much power does given social influencer on Instagram have? And the idea is that we sit back sometimes and we look at people like that and think, well, you know, they have power, but I don't. And I can tell you a quick, interesting story. My daughter is a social media influencer, and she had a channel on Instagram with tens of thousands of followers, I think about 30,000. And her channel was called Share Gets Fit. And she went to a convention for people that are influencers on Instagram and decided that she didn't like the way things were looking behind the scenes and has decided to shut that system down. And even though she was making more than enough money every month to pay her mortgage on her house, she chose, you could think of it this way, to disempower herself by, at least for a while, turning off her social media influencer status and reviewing products and making money online. So was that an increase in her power, or was that a decrease in her power? So I really want you to think hard about this question. If she's got all these influencers and she's got this position of influence and she's got all these followers, how could it empower her to turn that off? Wasn't that a source of power? But I think it's the exact opposite. I think that what my daughter did in terms of making a decision that was more in line with her personal values is that she increased her power over her world. Keeping in mind the question, were all those followers out there part of her world? Or was this just a mechanism that she was using to make money? And she made the choice, and then the choice went as she selected it. And I will have you informed of this fact. This is my opinion, but it's an opinion that I've given great thought to over the years, and I think it's very important. If you make a choice and you make the choice stick and you create change with that choice, and it's the change you want, then to the extent that you've got some kind of mass popularity or popularity in general, you've really increased your own power because you've exercised your control over your universe. Now, I'd like you to sort of stow that concept in your mind that she stopped being a slave to what she thought was a set of expectations that she had accepted in the formation of her social media channel. But at the end of the day, she's letting it drive her until she made the choice otherwise. When she flexed her muscle, when she exercised her power, she moved away from that and lost some influence in the world, but she got to shape her universe the way she wanted to. So when we talk about your power, I think we really need to stay focused on this idea of your universe. What is it you would use your power to do? So one of the things that we find that prevents us from having power is our own involuntary thought process. We have the ability to stifle ourselves, to bind ourselves, to confine ourselves in ways that I think we sort of know are in place. We know we're doing it to a degree, but we don't know the full extent of it. So awareness is a huge part of power. In other words, we could start, at least as a thought experiment, with the notion that we all have a certain latent, which means buried deep down inside of us, we all have a certain latent power that we could operate on the assumption that we don't have to increase that. We just have to stop decreasing that. Bruce Lee said, it's not daily increase, but daily decrease that matters. Hack away the non-essentials. That's not an exact quote, but it's pretty close to what Bruce Lee said. What he's talking about there is chopping away all the nonsense, getting rid of all the, what he used to call the classical mess, the stuff that gets in the way and keeps you from really flowing in the world. So let's talk about one way that we can increase that awareness, and that is by spotting a specific thing that we do, which decreases our power. Quit your bitchin'. And I like the idea of saying it, that way rather than be alert to the dangers of too much complaining. But quit your bitchin' is just easy to remember. Quit your bitchin'. Complaining is nothing more than a continuous maintenance of the sense of disempowerment we've created for ourselves by deciding that we can't be a causative agent or a force of nature, so to speak, in our universe, in our personal universe. Your universe is your world that you live in. It's your family, it's your friends, it's your job, it's your daily commute to work in the car, probably when you're listening to this podcast. That's what you're trying to control. You can't control anything beyond your universe, except by creating a domino effect the way social media does, or the way politics do, or when I was young, I used to send letters to the editor for various local newspapers. And I was pretty proud of the fact that anytime I sent a letter to the editor for a newspaper, and these were major newspapers, every letter I sent got published, which made me feel really good. But at the end of the day, what was I affecting? I couldn't see the results of my efforts. And therefore, those results were not manifesting in my universe. So to what good did this come? I don't know. It's sort of like putting a letter in a bottle and throwing it into the ocean and hoping somebody finds it someday. And if you're doing more than just, please help, come rescue me with such a letter, then you have to ask yourself, what was the point of this? A random stab into an unknown foreign universe, which is something beyond the boundaries of my life, my experience, and my role in the world. When we complain, we continue to tighten the knots. It's like we're tied to a chair, as if I'm sitting in this chair right here and I have rope around my ankles and my arms holding me to the chair. And if somehow I could just separate from my body and get away from the bondage just long enough to do anything, and the one thing I choose to do is tighten the damn ropes to make it even harder to get out of the chair. That's what you do when you complain. Now, we all love to complain because somehow it gives us a chance to vent our feelings. But it is a fact that sometimes when you vent your feelings, you reinforce the feelings you're venting. And when you get things off your chest, that's one thing. When you have an unexpressed thing that you need to communicate and it's bothering you that it's unexpressed and you express it, then you give yourself some relief. That's not the same thing as complaining. If I sit around and let's say, for example, that I don't like the noise my neighbor makes, and I think back to a time when I lived in a cheap apartment downtown Denver in the early days of my law career, and the people on the floor above me were always tossing fireworks off their balcony. And these weren't firecrackers. These were M80s. These were loud things that went off halfway between their balcony and the street below, which frequently was right outside my balcony. And I just sit and stewed and stewed and stewed and stewed. And I used to think up strange things to do. And I even gave some thought to pulling out my trusty 1911 and pounding some rounds into the bottom of their balcony, which was the roof of mine, just to see if that would rattle them a little bit. Because here's what happened. Even though I thought of myself as this high-powered professional personality in the form of a trial lawyer, I didn't have I didn't have the balls to go upstairs and knock on their door and ask them to quit it. Why? Why couldn't I confront a communication cycle like that? Why couldn't I just have this conversation? Well, that's because I tied myself to a chair psychologically, and I kept tightening the ropes by complaining about it instead of doing something about it. Now, when you talk about doing something about it, I think probably a lot of people in the audience hear these words and think, well, it's my boss. The number one thing people like to complain about, at least among my circle of friends, especially my employees, is they like to complain about the boss. I'm just joking. They don't complain about me too much because we run our office with a certain corporate culture that it involves a lot of affection, a lot of family camaraderie, and a lot of just joy in celebrating one another's unique skills. I'm very lucky that my law firm has that culture. Most firms do not. But I can tell you that in the average job, maybe somebody works as a cashier at a grocery store or some other what I would call everyday job, and they've got a boss that maybe has what I call a syndrome of being a petty official with a Hitler complex. Or the boss is always critical about small things, or is a sourpuss and just exudes negative energy. So they start to hate their boss, and they start to go home every day and complain about their boss, maybe to their spouse or their friends. What they are actually doing is tightening the ropes on their own self-bondage. One notion that obviously comes to mind when we discuss a scenario like that is to quit. I could just say the hell with it. I'm going to get a job somewhere else. And that would be the type of decision that establishes your power, your control, your ability to affect your universe. You could just quit. Well, quitting is the new pandemic, by the way, in this country, as coronavirus ebbs and flows and overall seems to be cooling off with people getting more and more vaccinations. And by the way, for the record, I am definitely a pro-vaxxer. I think that you don't have a right to infect other people willy-nilly, and there is a level of social responsibility that takes precedent over your own fears about a new medicine. And I know that some of you will probably turn off the podcast because you disagree with me about that. Well, turning off the podcast is a way of burying your head in the sand, and it's also a way of tightening the ropes on your own bondage. Maybe you should just listen and weigh and decide how much of this has value and how much of it doesn't, and keep your mind open to the things around you in the world. There's no necessarily constitutional right to become a contagion and to become a danger to the rest of society. That's just my personal view. I don't think we're going to get over this until more and more and more of the population is vaccinated. Enough about that. Let's go back to complaining about the boss. The boss wants you to get vaccinated. So you see, it all ties together. There are companies, and my daughter has this issue. My daughter, the social media influencer, is an aerospace engineer with Lockheed Martin. And Lockheed has decided that they are going to, because of some federal executive mandates, require employees that are full-time employees to get vaccinated. And she loves her job with Lockheed, but she really doesn't want to get vaccinated. We debate this in our household, and the debates are actually quite enjoyable. Lawyers like to debate, and they debate their family. But she could complain, God damn the boss. Why does he tell me what I put in my body? And there could be long-term unintended, unexpected side effects, consequences, or bad results from this new mRNA technology. I don't want to expose myself to it. It's my body. It's my choice. So then you could start to think about, well, the boss or whoever's pulling the boss's strings, in this case, the federal government, is, doing the wrong thing. And you could just sit around and bitch and moan about it. Again, you simply reinforce the dichotomy between someone else having power being exercised in a way you don't like versus your perceived lack of power. So just make it a rule in your life not to complain. Complaining doesn't do anything good. Everybody knows that, but it actually has a very negative effect on yourself when you complain. Figure out a way to change the things in your life that you don't like. I think probably when I say those words, a lot of people will think up the alcoholic's prayer or whatever they call that. God grant me to change the things I can, to accept the things I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference. There's great value in that sentiment, but let's focus on the first half of it. Grant me the power to change the things I can. Well, if you can change it, that means you have the power already, and you're just not using it. So why aren't you using it? Now, on this topic, I have a great tool for you, and I'm sure this is nothing new, but it's worth reiterating in your life, and that is the power of journaling. If you sit down every day or every fifth day or with some level of regularity, and you journal your thoughts as you explore internally the great landscape of your own self, and start to understand by brutally honest self-detection where you're holding yourself back, and start to try to ask yourself in a really candid way, why am I doing that? Why can't I go upstairs to that apartment above me and just tell them to quit throwing fireworks off the balcony? Why can't I just pick up the phone and call the police department and complain, or the landlord? That's a different kind of complaining, because I'm reporting something that the landlord or the police will take action on, at least in theory. But at the end of the day, why don't I just go knock on their door and give them a great big winning smile and say, hey, I'm Brett Godfrey. I live right below you. And when you throw those fireworks off the balcony, you're driving me crazy. And I'm going to ask you to stop doing that. Who knows what would have happened if I'd had the balls to just do that. And I know a lot of you in the audience are probably thinking, what a pansy I am for not being able to do it. I guarantee you today, if that happened, I would go do that. I would go knock on the door and ask them to stop. That's because I'm older now, and I've had a chance to play with this idea enough times that now I have a lot of confidence in my ability to do that. So what was holding me back was fear. Fear of what? Well, was I intimidated by the loud noise the fireworks made, and I let that transpose itself onto a mental image picture I had of the neighbors being violent, scary people? I spent my whole life in the martial arts. I'm a good warrior in many different ways, not just in a courtroom, but I at one time was pretty good on the street. Those days are gone now because I'm older and not in the shape I used to be. But why was I imagining the worst possible outcome instead of imagining a positive outcome and thinking of a good, smooth, effective way to get there? It's because I didn't take control. And the reason I didn't take control is because I spent all my time complaining. So just quit your bitching. Do your journaling. Figure out where you're holding yourself back from actively taking hold of the wheel in your life and applying yourself to your universe as an agent of change, as somebody who can cause an effect and do those things. Why are you not doing that? I see ad after ad after ad for various antidepressants that help with social anxiety. Social anxiety is different in the eyes of the mental health community from ordinary generalized anxiety. I work in a job, there's lots of threats coming at me every day in my litigation practice. I get out of bed every day, and there's somewhere between 30 and 60 lawyers out there getting out of bed at the same time I do. And every one of them's job in life is to find a way to beat me in a civil action, to beat me in a courtroom. And my job is nothing short of defeating every one of them. Now, if that's the reality of being a litigator, you can accept the idea that this is a stressful job. And if you do it for several decades, as I have, you start to think about life as just a constant state of being surrounded by enemies, which invokes a fight or flight response within a person, invokes anxiety. And that's not the same as social anxiety. Social anxiety is more like being at a party and you're afraid to walk up to a stranger and strike up a conversation because of how awkward it might feel. I'm not here to solve social anxiety for you today. I will in the future. I'll give you some great tips on that. I'm a very extroverted person. I think the podcast makes that obvious. But if you're not and you wish you had a little bit more confidence in social settings, I'll have some great tips for you down the road. But let's talk more about what thought processes that we allow to run unchecked, we allow them to stampede in around in our minds in a way that we suffer from, but we could turn all of that off. Why aren't we doing that? That's where your journaling will really come in handy for you, because you can start to write out circumstances and your response to the circumstances and why that may have been not the best response and what other response would have been better. The minute you write down what would have been a better response, you're opening your eyes, you're parting the curtains, you're getting a better view, and you're raising that awareness that we spoke of a moment ago, to get that awareness up so that you can start to interact with your world in a way that you didn't do before. And this is part of focusing your power. Now, the next little barrier that we run into is the idea that other people are more powerful than we are. And so I certainly I always love the example of Elon Musk, because as of right now, he's the richest man in the world. And he's got the ability to change the stock market. He's got the ability, literally, to put people on other planets. He's completely revised the automotive industry in the world. It seems like every day I read about a new electric car maker. Motor Trend Car of the Year this year was the Lucid Air, which is a competitor to Tesla. But that whole thrust of the industry was vanguarded, meaning that Elon was the tip of the spear to make that happen. He set that in motion by showing that you could make electric cars that work well and that are comfortable and drive well. And once everybody else saw that, now it's like lemmings. Now the whole automotive industry is moving in the direction where he, as a leader, forged new ideas and walked new ground. What about you? Can you do that? You don't have millions of dollars necessarily. Maybe some of you in the audience do. But what do you have? There's a little story I want to tell you. There's two quick anecdotes or little parables. One is that about halfway between Cheyenne and Laramie, Wyoming, on Interstate 80, there's a landmark which is essentially a gigantic boulder with a tree growing out of it, with a pine tree growing up out of the boulder. And it is surrounded by a chain link fence, and there are signs up. And it's kind of a special landmark for people that live in southern Wyoming. I used to commute back and forth between Cheyenne and Laramie quite often. And I always would look at that tree, and it gave me huge inspiration. Because one day a seed fell off of a tree and was caught in the sometimes ferocious Wyoming wind and carried along on that wind until it bounced off a rock and landed in a crack in a boulder. Well, lots of seeds blew into the soil where they could thrive and flourish and grow, but this seed kind of got the shit end of the stick, if you pardon my language, in the sense that it landed in a crack in a boulder. But this seed sort of rubbed up against the rock, and water would trickle down into the crack and carry with it some of the minerals from the surface of the rock, which are nutrients for plants. And it started to sprout, and it started to grow, and it kept surviving and kept growing and kept surviving. And I can tell you right now with certainty, it is the most respected tree in the state of Wyoming. Well, what power did it have? It had some. What could it do? I love the quote from one of the more recent Star Trek movies where Christopher Pine says to Zachary Quinto, Kirk talking to Spock, I have no idea what to do. I only know what I can do. I have no idea what to do or what I should do. I only know what I can do. So when you do your journaling, ask yourself that question frequently. What can I do? And you make a list. And some of the things you'll immediately want to censor yourself. You'll immediately, as soon as you get the idea, well, I could quit my job. Well, that's no good. Why? Maybe there's a better job out there. Do you have the courage to apply for a job that you don't have? That's like me knocking on the apartment above me with the M80s going off. Did I have the courage to just go knock on the door? Do you have the courage to knock on life's door and just smile and introduce yourself? Do you have the courage to apply for a new job? Do you have the courage to talk to your boss very respectfully and say, please, I'd have a request for you? Are you afraid you'll get fired on the spot? And if you do, what will you do then? Those are the thoughts that hold you back. You need to visualize a better outcome where you're just very respectful and you point out to the boss, when you attack me on this basis, you're a bitch. No, you don't say it that way. You say, it hurts my feelings when you do this or do that. And I want to do better. And I'm very grateful for your input and your guidance on how to do better. But when you get really mad at me, it makes my life really hard. And I'm wondering if we couldn't find a better rapport between the two of us, because I'm your best employee. And then prove it. Take the challenge. Show that boss that you can do whatever needs to be done better than they expected. Challenge yourself. Inspire yourself. This podcast is one way to do that. There are millions of motivational speakers in the world, and that motivational, upbeat flood of thoughts that are very helpful and useful that you get when you listen to the really good motivational speakers, the Anthony Robbinses of the world or the Jocko Willinks of the world. They're very, very good at getting you thinking like a winner. And some people complain and say, well, it doesn't last. Well, it's okay that it doesn't last. Listen to some more when it starts to wear off. Learn to talk to yourself the way Jocko Willink talks to you when you listen to his podcast. And this is part of picking up the reins, severing the bonds that hold you tied to the chair, and allowing yourself to have some freedom of movement and some effect on your universe. A little bit more on journaling, and then I'll get to the second of the two parables, the first one being the tree in Wyoming. And that is, there's two types of journaling that I have discovered. There's probably an infinite number of types of journaling, but the two that make sense to me are what I call composed journaling and the magic pencil journaling. Composed journaling is where I have thoughts in my mind that I'm aware of, but they're not clearly articulated even in my own thought process. So I will compose like a writer, the same way I do when I write a legal brief or a book like this. And I try to find a way to express it fluently and gracefully and articulately, and I may sculpt the words and eventually may even try to publish the words that I write. And that has great value, but it's got a limitation because it doesn't see beneath the covers or behind the curtain or whatever analogy you want to use. There is a phenomena that I've discovered for myself, and I think it's probably not just me. I think a lot of people would have it. I do my journaling with an Apple Pencil on an iPad, and I just let the pencil talk. I just let words flow into my mind, and I write them. I let words flow into my mind. My mind is my mind, and it's going to have words come to the surface according to its own machinations, its own mechanical function. I have to have some trust in that. Just let my hand write. Let the magic pencil find the words. And sometimes it just turns into gibberish, But a lot of times, the vast majority of the time, I start seeing things occurring on the screen where the first half of the sentence happened all by itself, just out of nowhere. And then I finish the sentence. And the next thing you know, I'm writing as fast as I can because now I've got a flood of buried internal stuff that's coming to the surface. And that opens up the door for direct analytical evaluation, meaning I'm using my logical mind to sort it out. And usually by the end, then I'm back to composing. But don't be afraid to let your pencil just run without any really carefully thought out agenda in advance. Next, I just want to tell you a little parable, now the second parable, about your own personal power. I had a scoutmaster who was one of the most remarkable human beings I've met in my 62 years of living when I was a young scout. And we had the largest Boy Scout troop in Denver. It was Troop 582. And the scoutmaster's name was Salo. And he wanted me to understand that I had more power than I realized. So he told me a story from his youth. When he was a young boy, he found a couple of harmonicas that had been sitting on a park bench that someone had left behind. And instead of trying to find the owner, he just kept the two harmonicas and learned to play one of them. And he had this other harmonica and he didn't know what to do with it. Well, there was a kid in his school who he calls the dorky kid. And he was just kind of this awkward, annoying person who didn't have, or apparently seemed to have very many friends. People tended to avoid him. He was always lonely and insecure. But I think we always have people like that in our lives that we sort of almost feel a subliminal need to stay away from because it feels awkward just getting around them until we learn how to communicate. So what Mr. Salo did is he took the second harmonica and he gave it to the dorky kid. And he couldn't believe the range of expressions on the dorky kid's face, that the joy, the gratitude, the disbelief that somebody would give him a present, this great sense of, gosh, this kind of thing never happens to me, but look, and the look of pure adulation on the kid's face when he looked at Mr. Salo as a boy. And he realized, wow, he'd done something really nice and he was feeling warm and good about it. But then the dorky kid was playing the harmonica everywhere all the time, in the playground, in the hallways, and he wasn't playing tunes. He was just making noise with it, sort of like a kazoo. And one day, Mr. Salo was very irritated. Something bad had happened to him. Maybe he got a bad grade on a test or something. I can't remember what it was, but he was in a bad mood and he was feeling irritable. And the dorky kid came along and started making this racket with this harmonica, and it was driving Mr. Salo as a boy nuts. So he took the harmonica back and he dropped it down through the grate on a sewage grate in the street. And he watched the dorky kid's face fall to a level of despair, depression, and it just shattered the kid that he did that. And so Salo felt immediately horrible. He said the next day he gave his harmonica to the dorky kid and said, just be careful where you play this. You don't have to be making noise everywhere you go. But he gave his harmonica, so he undid the damage he had caused. And now he spent the next several decades of his life analyzing what had happened in that scenario. And he realized each of us is imbued with power far beyond what we realize. We do have the power through what may to us seem like the tiniest of things to create huge effects, positive and negative, in other people. And that experience stood as a sort of a bulwark of examples in his mind and said, never forget how much power you have. Just think of the harmonica. the story of the harmonica and our unimaginable inner powers that we have. Even if we don't go found the next multi-million-dollar, multi-billion-dollar PayPal or Tesla or whatever, we do have far more power than we actively contemplate day in and day out. So focus your power, quit your bitching, do your journaling, take action, be willing to knock on the door and smile and make it known what you want. I'm Brett Godfrey, and this is Viewpoint. Thank you for listening.